Alright, so the next type of tissue we'll talk about is connective tissue. Now, connective tissue is found all throughout the body. It makes up a big part of our body, actually. It helps us, provides us with structure. It helps in some cases with movement of stuff within the body, and it helps with movement for full-on gross movement, like movement of our actual arms and legs. So it provides the supporting fabric of the body, and as we get into these more examples, you'll understand that a bit better. Now, what is very special about connective tissue is that connective tissue is always made up of two parts, okay? First, it's made up of the living part, which is going to be the cells, okay? All tissue has cells. That's, in order for a tissue to work, it has to have cells. But what's exclusive, or what's different about connective tissue is that a large part of the connective tissue is made up of a non-living component. So we have the living cells, and those living cells are found in a non-living component that we call the matrix. Now, the physical properties of the matrix is what gives rise to the different functions and the different types of connective tissues that we have. So we can have really loose, really fluid, liquid matrix, and that's going to give us our circulating connective tissue. The matrix can be a little bit more dense, and that'll give us our generalized connective tissue. So it's not quite a liquid, but it's not quite a solid. It's like a gel. That's our generalized connective tissue. And finally, the matrix can be really, really hard if it's full of different minerals and salts, and that can give us our structural connective tissue. So we'll go through it in this unit, and we'll explain what each one of these things are. But don't forget, there's the living part, the cells, and the non-living part, which is the matrix. Okay, so let's first talk about the circulating connective tissue. Now, these are fluids, and these fluids will travel through vessels. They'll travel throughout the body. They can carry nutrients, they can carry gases, they can carry waste. They can also have a really vital role in our immune system. So there's a lot of different functions, but keep in mind, since it's a connective tissue, it's going to have the cells, the living part, and it's going to have the matrix, which is the non-living part. So if we look at our two examples here, we've got blood and we've got lymph. Now, in the case of the blood, we've got our cells in our matrix. So the cells are going to be those red blood cells and the white blood cells and the platelets, and the matrix in this case is going to be the blood plasma, right? So that's the non-living part, and then the living part is the cells. So you guys know where we find blood. It circulates through the heart, blood vessels, through our organs, and it provides the body with nutrients, and it helps with gas exchange. The second example there is the lymph. Now, this is probably not quite as well known as the blood, but again, we have the fluid, which is going to be the matrix, and that's derived from fluids that's left over in blood plasma. And then we'll have our cells that live in there too, and they're mostly immune cells, so white blood cells, and they'll provide an extensive network within our body to fight infection and keep us healthy. And this circulating connective tissue is going to be found in lymphatic vessels that travel throughout the body. So that's the first type. That's the circulating connective tissue, where we get a matrix that's kind of liquid. Now, when we moved into the generalized connective tissue, now we're talking about the matrix becoming more and more hard. So depending on the degree of hardness in the matrix, we're going to have 4 different types. We're going to have loose, dense, cartilage, and finally bone. So those 4 types of generalized connective tissue are going to be where we see the matrix become much more hard, certainly not a liquid like we've seen in the circulating connective tissue. So the loose connective tissue, we'll get 2 types. It's got a soft matrix, so not really, really hard. It's mostly made up of some different fibers, like collagen fibers, for example. So 2 different types. We have areolar connective tissue, and we've got a mixture of cells and fibers, and they'll live in a semi-liquid matrix. And areolar connective tissue is found throughout the body. It's a really, really common form. We find it all around our organs and vessels. We find it in our membranes. We find it under the skin. It's one of the connective tissues that helps connect our skin to our muscles. So it's really, really common, and we'll see a slide in the lab when we have our histology lab. The second type of loose connective tissue is the adipose tissue. Now this is fat. Again, we have cells that are modified as really the only thing they do is store lipids. So that can act as an energy supply. Stored lipids can be used for energy if it's broken down. But another thing that it does is it provides padding around our organs, near our joints. It helps for insulation to keep us warm. So it's a common and it's a really versatile tissue. So here's a couple of examples of the circulating loose connective tissue. You can see here when we're talking about the blood, the matrix, we can't quite see it because it's a liquid, so it's going to be in all these white places in between the cells. If we look at some more connective tissue right here, we'll be looking at areolar. And down here, we're looking at adipose. So the matrix is what gives those tissues its rigidity, its shape, and helps support its function. And then we're going to move into the more dense connective tissue. So this matrix is going to be found, it's going to be filled up with large numbers of collagen and elastic fibers. Now, collagen's a really tough protein, so the more collagen we have in there, the more dense, the more rigid that tissue is going to be. Elastic fibers are not as dense as collagen fibers. They're quite flexible, so they're going to give that tissue a little bit of flexibility, and the collagen is going to give it a lot of rigidity. So these types of tissue are going to provide protection. It's going to give a lot of support to certain structures. It's going to use for attachments between bones, and it's going to give us flexibility. So we can have irregular dense connective tissue where we'll find mostly collagen fibers, but they'll be randomly arranged. So you'll find that in certain membranes, capsules at the end of the bones. And then we can have the regular ones, which are those collagen fibers are going to mostly be parallel. And if you think about a regular dense connective tissue, we'll be talking about ligaments and tendons. So the things that attach the muscles to the bone and bone to bone. Another type of connective tissue that has a very strong and flexible solid matrix is cartilage. Well, cartilage is going to provide you with a ton of protection. It gives structure to a lot of our organs. Think about the tip of your nose and your ears, for example. And it provides shock absorption because we find it between our bones. So our bones don't rub together. They're actually cartilage that rubs together, not the bones. And elasticity. So it does give us some flexibility. We have three different types of cartilage. We have hyaline cartilage. This stuff is tough and translucent, and it's probably the most common type of cartilage we can find. If you touch the tip of your nose, you're touching hyaline cartilage. So that'll give you an idea of the density of the matrix. It also connects the ribs to the sternum. If you pull your throat, you can feel it in your larynx and your trachea. Those are all examples of hyaline cartilage. The next type is fibrocartilage. Now this stuff is quite firm and quite rigid. These are going to make up the discs in your back. If you've ever heard of those, the little pieces of cartilage that go between each vertebrae in your back, those are going to be made up of fibrocartilage. And the last one we have is the elastic cartilage. This has got way more elastic fibers than it does than the other two. And what that does is it allows a structure to have a shape, be flexible but rigid at the same time. So think about your outer ear. You can pinch your outer ear, you can move it around, and then if you let go of it, it'll spring back into shape. So those are examples of different types of cartilage, and that's the elastic cartilage. And one of the last ones we'll talk about in connective tissue is bone. Now, bone matrix is a solid, okay? It's hardened with mineral salts. It makes up all of the bones in your body, your skeleton. It gives us our rigid structural support. It also provides a lot of protection. Think about the brain being completely surrounded by the skull. If you think about the cardiovascular system, the lungs and heart, and some of the digestive system, completely surrounded by ribs. So lots and lots of protection there. And it works with the muscles so that we can move. So it's quite an important tissue. Having a look at these different types of tissue here, we'll have fibrocartilage right here. Whoops. This up here will be elastic cartilage. And down here is going to be bone. We're going to have a look at the way the bone is organized, and we'll have a look at it on the slides in the lab. And it's quite a tissue to see microscopically. Okay, the next two types of tissue, muscle tissue and nervous tissue, we'll go through those really, really quickly because we're going to come back to those in a later unit. But muscle tissue is a tissue that's designed to produce movement. Okay, muscle tissues, what they do is they get shorter and then they relax and they get longer. That's what they do. That combination of getting shorter and getting longer is what allows for all of the movement of our body. Okay, now we've got different types of muscle that we find in different parts of our body. We have skeletal muscle, we have smooth muscle, and we have cardiac muscle. Now, the cardiac one, you can probably imagine, is the stuff that makes up our heart. Okay, and when we call muscle tissues, we call them fibers. So the cardiac one is the ones that make up our heart, and often you'll hear it called the myocardium. Again, we'll get into that a little bit more. Now, skeletal muscles are they're voluntary, which means we can control them. We have total control of our skeletal muscles with our brain. The other types of muscles we don't, which is a good thing. These are long tubulars, so the muscles are shaped like this, and they're striated. So when we say striated means they're striped, or they have layers on them. So it kind of looks like this. They're also multinucleate, so you will see lots of nuclei on a skeletal muscle. When we look at the cardiac muscle, they're shaped quite a bit differently. They're short. They can be branched. The other skeletal muscles can't be. So they can look like that. And they have these things called these intercalated discs. And they're really thick striations. And that marks the boundary between one muscle fiber. So this is our first muscle fiber here. This would be a second one, and a third one, and a fourth one. So they're involuntary, so we can't control the beating of our heart, the contraction of our skeletal, of our cardiac muscles. That's looked after by different parts of our brain. They're also striated too, so they have those stripes that go across the muscle. So those are pretty easy to recognize under a microscope. The third type of muscle is the smooth muscle, and we often call that the visceral muscle. It's involuntary, it's unstriated, and it's got quite a different shape than the other two. So it'll kind of be shaped long, with kind of a flat, fat middle, and they'll have one nucleus in the middle like that. And the way the tissue forms is these cells kind of overlap like this, and so on and so forth. So they're involuntary, so we'll find those inside of our body where there's movement. So our digestive system, through our glands and stuff like that, and they're unstriated, so there's none of those stripes that we find on those. So looking at here, this is going to be the skeletal. And those stripes, the striations, that's what I was talking about earlier. And you can see there's lots of nuclei there. This is going to be the cardiac. We can't see the actual fibers, but if you look at these dark lines, right here, those are those intercalated discs that I talked about on the last slide. And then finally down here, this is going to be the smooth muscle. Now, the last tissue that we'll talk about is the nervous tissue, and we're going to do a whole unit on this. So just know that the nervous tissue is specialized tissue, specialized cells that carry messages to and from all parts of the body. Okay, we organize and break down the nervous system into several different subsystems, and depending on what it does, depending on its function, and like I said, we'll get back to it later on. And the main parts that make up the nervous tissues are going to be the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves, and the neuroglia. Very oftentimes when we're talking about the nervous system, we talk about neurons, which are going to be the nervous cells.